Side 6. But the tide was in. Lindisfarne was an island, cut off by a mile of sea, almost hidden, a grey, long, flat shadow in the teeming rain. "I've got to get back to camp," said Artie. "I'm on guard duty in an hour and my kit's filthy. But I can't leave you out in this." He sat with his hands clenched round the steering wheel, chewing at his teeth, the lines deepening on his face. Harry knew he was in agony, like a fox caught by its leg in a trap. And the trap was the army. If Artie wasn't on duty in an hour, he'd be in real trouble. Lose his stripes, maybe get sent to the glass house. He must let Artie out of the trap. It was the one good thing to do, though it felt like stepping off the edge of the world. He said gently, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice, "Find me a thick hawthorn hedge under a tree, that'll keep me dry." Artie looked at him. His eyes were grateful and very ashamed. "You're a good kid. I wish I could take you home to my missus. She'd look after you. This bloody awful war." They had to drive around quite a lot to find a hawthorn hedge with a tree, but they found one at last, and Artie lifted down all his kit, gave Don a last rough, desperate pat, shook hands and drove away without looking back. It was only after the truck had vanished that Harry realised he had something pressed into his right hand after Artie's last handshake. A little wad of dirty paper. He opened it up and saw 3 very oily pound notes, and heard again Artie's last desperate words. "Keep in touch, son. Let me know you're getting on all right." £3. That was a whole week's wages for Artie, more. How could he afford his fags now? And Harry didn't even need the money. He had plenty of money. When he got settled again, he would write to Artie and send the money back. Meanwhile, he was getting wet, and no means of getting dry again, and that was the only thing that made sense at the moment. Harry forced his way into the hedge. It was quite dry in there, lots of dry leaf mould with only a few prickles. He curled up tight with Don, smelling the doggy smell of him for comfort, driving his face into Don's fur to block the world out. And he slept. A queer, jerky sleep, full of dreams that switched from one scene to another. Sometimes he was sea-coaling on the beach with Joseph, sometimes walking through the woods with Artie, sometimes back at his own house, staring at the little blue flames licking up from the bricks that had once been home, and sometimes on the beach before the war, building sandcastles. But always Merman was somewhere about, Merman with his bleeding face, wanting. Then he would jolt awake and see the dull grey sky showing through the dark green hawthorn leaves, and hear the endless sound of the rain, and know that Merman was far away, like everything else. Everything was far away, except the world, which was a big, black, cold hole now, reaching in with icy fingers to steal his very life. Then he would bury his face in Don's warm fur and sleep again. It was the sunset that woke him, shining in through the leaves, a magnificent sunset. It had stopped raining, and the pilot's watch said 4 hours had passed, 6 o'clock. Above his head, the hedge and big tree were dripping, right onto his head. They'd kept him dry till now, but they were going to make him very wet if he stayed much longer. Nothing for it but to get on the move again, and he was ravenous. He stumped along, head down, not wanting to look at the world. Don ran ahead, full of life, questing for food without a care in the world. Once again, Harry wished he was a dog. Chapter 13. He walked up the rain-soaked road towards the sunset, which was a lovely lemon yellow, and turning the road lemon yellow too, so he seemed to walk on light, on sky. It lifted him a little, above the dense mass of misery about Artie. While the sunset lasted, he felt he could keep going, he could almost fly above his troubles. But he knew that when the dark came, he'd plunge deep, deep back into them. Keep walking away from them. Around him the fields were empty, but there was a house ahead where the road met the sky, a house with 2 chimneys smoking. They must be rich to have 2 fires going at once in wartime. He imagined a table laid for supper, with cloth serviettes and heavy silver knives and forks, like they had in Carrick's Cafe in Newcastle. Pork pie and chips, big, fat Carrick's chips. The thought was a mistake. His belly filled up suddenly with the fizzy liquid of hunger, but he went on with his fantasy about the house. It was the house of somebody he knew. They were waiting for him to come home. Oddly enough, at that point, and he was still 100 metres away, The figure of a woman came out of the garden gate and stood in the road watching. Only she was in silhouette against the sunset, and he couldn't tell if she was staring at him or away from him. But he could tell from the way her elbows stuck out that her hands were clasped tight together. She was waiting for somebody, and anxious as well. He still had the absurd idea she was waiting for him. But it must be somebody out of sight, beyond the brow of the hill, for there was no one on the road behind him. He'd checked. Then, as he got nearer, he saw she was looking at him. She'd come down the road 10 paces towards him. She gestured to him as if urging him on. Again he looked behind him, but there was nobody. She shouted something urgent, which he couldn't make out. Unable to bear the suspense, he broke into a feeble trot, all the weight of pack and pans on his back banging away. As he neared her, she reached out and grabbed both his hands. He looked bewildered at her middle-aged, bespectacled face. He didn't know her from Adam. She was a total stranger, but she was yelling at him urgently. "My mother's fallen on the stairs and I can't lift her. Come quick, help me lift her." If she hadn't been holding his hands, he might well have run away. He was scared of old age and illness. He had enough troubles of his own. But the woman had a firm grip on him, so he went. Up the crazy paving path, with huge white conch shells lined up on both sides, dreading what he might see when his eyes got used to the dark hallway. A massive bulk at the foot of the stairs. Fat, grey-clad legs sprawled any old house, skirt right up above the knees. A clutter of sprawled arms and knobbly sticks. And a face. The face smiled up at him. "Oh, there's a kind lad," the old lady said. It was a headmistressy sort of face, with white hair piled high and gold-rimmed spectacles perched on the nose and dangling a gold chain. He knew in an instant that this was no useless old granny. This was somebody far too important to be left lying in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. "If you'll take this hand," said the old lady, as calm and decisive as Field Marshal Montgomery, "Ada can manage the other. Now, both heave together, and stop flapping, Ada. I'm not dead yet." There was one tremendous heave and she was on her feet, her spectacles wildly awry. She adjusted them and said, "Sticks!" Ada grovelled behind her and produced the sticks. The old lady settled her grip on them both, nodded to Harry as if to say all was well, and said, "Come in, young man," and led the way in stately fashion. The room was large and cosy, with a blazing fire and bookshelves all over the walls. But what caught his eye was a table laid for supper, with big fat silver knives and forks, just like at Carrick's Cafe. "You'll stay for a bite, of course. Take his bags upstairs, Ada. Set another place. We must look after our rescuer. Do sit down, Master... I'm afraid I didn't catch your name." "Harry Baggerly." He shook hands solemnly. "I expect you'd like to wash your hands, Master Baggerly. Show him to the bathroom, Ada." The bathroom smelt fragrant and female, like their bathroom at home after Mum had had a bath, only much more so. He was almost afraid to use the pale pink towel in case he left a dirty mark on it. He washed his face and hands 3 times, then dried them on his filthy handkerchief. But he borrowed a large pink comb and combed his hair, and carefully checked for hairs afterwards, and pulled the hairs out of the comb and put them in his pocket to throw away later. Then he grew afraid that he had made that small dirty mark on the pale pink carpet, and spent 3 minutes trying to scrub that out with his hanky and spit. He hovered on the landing, suddenly terribly shy. But the old lady's head appeared and she said, "Ah, there you are." And then he had to go downstairs. "Do sit here. I expect you're ready for your supper. I see you've been camping. You haven't had very good weather for the first week of your holiday." "No, it's been a bit wet." He realised how posh her voice was against his own, even though he was talking to her the proper way he talked to the teachers at school. "Camping by the sea?" He followed her eyes. There was a small pile of sand on the carpet where his bag had rested for a moment. His mouth fell open with embarrassment, but she just said, "I've loved the sea all my life, since I was a young girl. Used to swim every day, 3 times a day when I could. My father used to call me the mermaid." He thought that she didn't look much like a mermaid now. She said, "I don't look much like a mermaid now, do I?" and roared with laughter. Then she said, "Tell me all the things you've been up to. Your dog's quite snug in the kitchen, by the way. Ada found a ham bone for him, with a bit of meat on." So he told her all about Joseph, while Ada bustled in with plates of sliced ham and tomato, and a stand full of scones and a large sponge cake. By the end of tea, his belt felt very tight. He knew he'd made a pig of himself, but she kept urging him on with a kind of glee. "I know what appetites young men like you have." Halfway through tea, the sunset had faded and it had begun to rain, a heavy, hopeless rain that battered at the windows. When he'd refused a 4th piece of cake, the old lady pushed back a chair, grasped her sticks and said, Not a night for camping out, I'm afraid. Come and sit by the fire. Then when he had sat, she said, Ada, make up the bed in young David's room. And that was that. He might as well have been kidnapped and chained up for all the chance he had of getting away that night. But he didn't seem to mind. He was full, he was warm, and he'd lost any desire to go anywhere. A great calm had descended on him. Until Ada returned and said, What about pyjamas? Well, lay out a pair of David's. I'm sure boys don't wear pyjamas when they're camping. And lay out David's dressing gown and slippers. She looked at Harry's startled face. David won't mind. Much too busy hunting U-boats off Bermuda and getting off with local girls, I've no doubt. She smiled conspiratorially, and he smiled back. She said, It's nice having a boy around the house again. Though why nice boys turn into boring middle-aged men, I've no idea. Tell me about your school. It was a long, cosy evening. She was a good listener, and he talked more than he had done for years, about making a model yacht and sailing it with Dad, about bullying at school. It was hard to keep off the things he didn't want her to know, the dark bits, the last bombing, the fight between Artie and Corporal Merman. They hardly saw Ada at all. First she was washing up in the kitchen, then she was making up the bed upstairs, then she was fetching supper drinks. That dog dry yet? Good. Boys always like to go to bed with their dogs. Just take him a walk around the garden first, Ada. Stop draining. We don't want any doggy accidents, do we, Harry? Then she talked on herself. About before the war, and the weekend parties, and the housefuls of young men, and the horses and sailing boats, and sailing out to the farms and having picnics, with the gulls wheeling overhead, catching titbits on the wing. How fascinating she was. He'd never realised how fascinating an old person could be. Not like the dull middle-aged Ada, who seemed to do nothing but work and ask what was next to be done. It was midnight before the party broke up. It was the grandfather clock striking 12 that did it. I must go to bed, she said, like Cinderella. He stood up, the spell broken. Give me a good-night kiss, Harry, she said. I might be 60, but I still enjoy being kissed by handsome young men. But it was the silent Ada who showed him up to his room, where the sheets were turned down and the pyjamas laid out, pyjamas that were far too big for him. Will you be all right getting her upstairs? Asked Harry, worried. She's better at going up, said Ada shortly. Good night. He had to roll the sleeves of the pyjamas up, or they'd have been unbearable. But he and Don slept soundly, with the scent of the lavender sheets filling the room. In the morning, Ada wakened him with a cup of tea. Breakfast'll be ready in half an hour. The table was laid for one. Where's in bed? Said Ada shortly. And will be for the next 3 days, that's if she's lucky. She overdid things last night. She always does, when she has a man about the house. She always liked the men. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. You did her a lot of good, really. She doesn't see much of life now. David, all the others, too busy with the war. We've not seen anybody but the postman for months. When they're not fighting, they're living it up in London. I don't blame them, really. They need their relaxation, but they don't know how bad she is, and she'll not let me write and tell them. Proud she is. She'll not have their pity, not when she could always wrap them around her little finger when she was younger. That's her, when she was young. She showed him a photograph from the mantelpiece in a silver frame. A young girl was laughing, eyes full of mischief, wearing a white sailor dress and holding the hand of a man in blazer and white flannels. They looked very happy together. Is that her husband? No, just one of her young men. She had so many young men. They took her sailing, fox hunting, up in aeroplanes later on. She was always one for a dare. She took part in the London-Paris air race when she was 44. Climbed Mont Blanc when she was 48, with young men half her age. What about you? I was never one for that sort of thing. But you, Master Harry, you're the last of a long line. Can't I say goodbye? She wouldn't like you seeing her as she is now. Go on, eat your breakfast and get off, wherever you're going. She came to the gate to see him off, with a pack of fresh-made sandwiches. Can I come back again? You can try. Don't leave it too long. Chapter 14. It was a grand morning. As he headed back towards the sea, the sun shone in his eyes, and he felt zooms of excitement running through him. Zooms he couldn't explain at all, except the grass was so green and twinkling with last night's rain, and there were flowers everywhere in the grass, tiny spots of yellow and blue. And all the birds were singing their heads off, and he seemed to have it all to himself. The whole show was for his benefit, and the sandwiches put him one meal away from worry. Today, he wouldn't have to think about food with that huge breakfast inside him that made even burping a pleasure, for it brought back the taste of porridge and bacon and egg and marmalade. He reached the coast in a rush, for the land sloped down towards the sea, and there, spread before him, lay the island of Lindisfarne, with the road to it clear, a dark bar of sand leading across the shining water. Everything was on his side, and he made up his mind. To Lindisfarne he would go. He was a pilgrim, and he would finish his pilgrimage. He was as ignorant of Lindisfarne as any Geordie boy of his age. He knew it was called Holy Island because hundreds of years ago monks had lived on it. One of them had been a saint, St. Cuthbert, and the tide went in and out, making it part of the land twice a day and an island twice a day, and that was all he knew. But the very look of the island, with the shadows of clouds drifting across its green hide, spotted like the hide of a cow with brown patches of sand dunes, it did not look like part of the world of bombs and vicious farmers, and the terrible battle to get enough to eat, and even newspapers to wipe your backside with. He just knew it was an enchanted place, a further shore. He knew he was crossing not the North Sea, but the River Jordan that the vicar talked about in church, like Christian in the Pilgrim's Progress, and trumpets would sound for him when he reached the other side. There was a cottage as he left the land. A man leaning on his gate, smoking a pipe, called out, 2 hours, you got a grand deal for it? He didn't know what the man meant, but he waved back cheerfully. The wet sand was firm beneath the army boots that Artie had given him, and even the juggling pans on his back were merry companions. Don loved the hugeness of it, ran ahead, barking for joy, ran in huge circles, pouncing on bits of seaweed, charged at the flocks of feeding gulls, sending them exploding into the air like white fireworks. "I'm coming," thought Harry. "I'm coming," he said to the island, all the way across. The only thing that worried him were the 2 watchtowers. The first he came up to when he was a third of the way across, a gaunt erection of tarred wood piles and rusting iron girders that thrust itself leaning from the sand. There was a little tarred cabin on top with a pointed roof, and the legs were thick with barnacles and seaweed. It looked like it had been there a very long time, fighting the waves. There was a thin-runged ladder leading up into it. He took off his gear and climbed the ladder, but the little cabin was completely empty, except people had carved and penciled names and dates all over the planks inside, and phrases like, "Oh dear, caught again," and "a bitter cold night." It felt unpleasantly like a prison somehow. It didn't feel a happy place. Of course, it couldn't be a prison really. It was obviously to do with the war. It reminded him of the watchtowers the Nazis had around their prison camps. He left it quickly and didn't check up on the other one half a mile further on. Then he was on the beach of Lindisfarne itself, with an endless row of sand dunes on his left. He climbed up one that was higher than the others and looked ahead. The sand dunes seemed to go on forever, but there were grey buildings at the end of them, and what looked like ruins. He went on. He was plodding now. The weight of the pack was starting to cut into his shoulders. Some of the brightness seemed to go out of the morning. Then the sun went behind clouds. He sat down to rest, and the thought of the pack of sandwiches tempted him. He tried to resist. He'd had a good breakfast. It was just gutsiness. But the thought of the sandwiches went on tormenting him, and finally he thought he'd allow himself just one. The trouble was, they were ladies' sandwiches, not soldiers' sandwiches, small and dainty and tasty. He had a second and a third. Don came up and begged for one trustingly. He knew the rules. What they had, they shared. Before Harry knew it, nearly all the sandwiches were gone. He closed the packet when there were 3 left, and shoved them violently back in the pack with a fury that broke them. He suddenly felt very depressed, and got up and started walking quickly before he felt any worse. He knew these sudden depressions. They always came when the sun went in. As he reached the houses, the treacherous sun came out again, and he felt better. But the houses were just a village like any other village, and the people standing in the cottage doors looked at him in a close, nosy, silent way that he hadn't ever noticed on the mainland. He felt at any moment they were going to ask him what he wanted. He felt if he stopped walking on, looking at all lost, they would ask him what he wanted. So he headed on towards the ruins, which at least looked interesting. He met a man at the gate of the ruins. He would have liked to ask him about St. Cuthbert, but the man said sharply, "If you're going in there, keep hold of that dog." He wandered around the ruins with Don on a leash, Don didn't like that very much. He kept on tugging furiously at the leash, wanting to sniff, wanting to be free, wanting to pee on the old stones as well. He lifted his hind leg twice, and Harry had to drag him away, because out of the corner of his eyes he could see the man was still lingering by the gate, watching. The ruins were quite interesting, especially the single arch of stones that was still in place that had once helped hold up the long-departed roof. It was so high and pointed and slender, you wondered how it could even hold itself up now. And the stones in the walls were worn by the wind and rain into such strange shapes, like goblins' grinning faces or squatting fat birds. But you could only stare at stones for so long, especially when the sun went in again. In the end, they were only stones. Then it began to rain. Next to the ruins was a church, which still had the roof on. They ran for it, made it into the porch together. Timidly, Harry tried the great iron ring on the church door. The door swung open silently on greased hinges. Inside it was nice, full of bright things and with a strange sweet smell. And there was a little green baize card table by the door with little books stacked on it called A Life of St. Cuthbert. Eagerly he reached for one, opened it. He'd always been a keen reader. He missed his books. "Have you paid for that?" The voice made Harry jump guiltily. It was the man from the ruins who must have followed him. "Not yet," said Harry. I was just looking." "Then pay for it or put it down. We can do without dirty fingerprints all over them." Harry reached in his pocket and found a threepenny bit. "Don't give it to me," said the man. "Can't you read what it says? Put it in that box with a slit in it." Blushing, Harry looked round for the box. He seemed to have a lot of trouble getting the coin through the slit, with the man glaring at him. Then the man said, "What's the idea of bringing that great dog into the church? Haven't you got any manners? Haven't you been taught the difference between right and wrong?" "I'll tie him up outside." "You'll not. I didn't want him peeing all over the churchyard. And look at all the sand on your boots. It's going all over the floor." Harry glared at the man, and the man glared back. "You're nothing but a little heathen," said the man. "God knows where you were dragged up. You a gypsy or something?" He glanced at the pans dangling from the pack on Harry's back. "Just looking for a chance to steal from the church, weren't you?" Harry felt treacherous hot tears starting to gather in the corners of his eyes. He yelled, "Back home! I go to church with me mum twice every Sunday." "Where's that then?" "St. Peter's, Boltwell." "Well, get back there and chill sand all over their floor. See how they like it." "Suffer the little children to come into me, and forbid them not, for such is the kingdom of heaven," roared Harry. He had gone to church twice every Sunday, and a lot of what he'd heard had stuck in his mind. "You what?" shouted the man. "You little toy! How dare you quote scriptures at me? I'll belt you on the lug!" "If anyone should offend these little ones," roared Harry, "it were better that a millstone was hanged around his neck and he was flung into the sea." Once started, he found it very hard to stop, especially when he quarrelled with strange adults. The man's jaw dropped open. He was speechless. Then he raised his hand for a blow. Don growled warningly. "Get out," said the man. "Get out of our church." Harry got. At the churchyard gate he turned back and shouted, "Call yourself a Christian?" But it didn't make him feel any better. And it was worse when he looked across back to the mainland. The tide had come in. The sand bridge was gone. Wherever he looked there were the waves of the shining ocean. He was cut off. Suddenly the whole island felt like a terrible trap. He wanted to sit down and howl, but he knew that he had to keep moving. People were still watching him, and some were kids his own age. The school holidays must have started. That's what Ada's mother must have meant last night when she said a wet week for the start of your holiday. Kids were bad. He didn't mind the adults so much. All they could do was shout and threaten, but gangs of kids. He kept walking. He walked round the harbour and looked at the fishermen fiddling with their boats. He walked up to the headland with a castle on it, but warning notices kept him from going anywhere near it, and barbed wire. He'd never known such an unfriendly place. And there were a gang of kids following him now. 4 of them, and 2 of them were bigger than he was. They followed him everywhere, pointing at the stuff he was carrying and taking the mickey and sniggering. They followed him to the far end of the civilized bit, where the sand dunes started on the east coast. He had hoped they would leave him alone if he left their village, but they still followed. When he tried to get back to the village, they stood and blocked his way, and then he realised he'd made a bad mistake. Now they could drive him back into the sand dunes and do what they liked with him, without even their horrible parents interfering. He walked north up the coast as fast as he could. They followed at a distance, but closing up slowly. Their voices on the wind grew gloating. They didn't know him. They thought he was running away. What he was doing was looking for a weapon and a place to fight. Just as they got really near, he found both together. A ruined boat, from which he snapped a 3-metre length of curved rib. It was worn with age, and the end fitted smoothly into his hand. He took off his pack behind the boat and turned to face them. They jeered, "Look, he thinks he's Tarzan!" But they were suddenly thoughtful, doubtful. "He's a gypsy? Gypsies don't fight fair? Hey, maybe he's got a knife? If he'd got a knife, he'd have it out, wouldn't he?" They edged closer, giving sudden jumps towards him, raising their arms, yelling, judging him, trying to scare him. He stood his ground, just raising the wooden rib. He'd picked out the leader. The leader was the one he'd try and hit. The leader would come in first, pretending he was the bravest. They jumped back and forward so much, just avoiding the whistling end of his piece of wood, trying to grab it off him, that when they did really attack, they almost caught him out. He swung up his piece of wood too late. Except that the leader got in the way of the upswing. It just happened to catch him between his legs. He gave a strangled shriek and fell writhing on the sand. Harry felt another hand grab for the wood and tugged it back and lashed out with all his strength in a panic. It thumped home on somebody else and there was a proper yelp. Then he was knocked flat, and the wood was held so he couldn't move it, and what felt like a boot hit him agonizingly in the ribs. And then there was a barking, slavering hurricane above him, and the sharp snap of teeth, and another yelp of pain. And then they were gone. He leapt to his feet, his legs shaking. Saw 3 of them standing 10 metres off. One was clutching his shoulder like it hurt, another held a wrist from which blood trickled, and the leader was still trying to crawl in agony back to his henchmen, doubled up with pain. They shouted at each other, "Go and get sticks! Go and get Billy Prudhoe and his brother, and Alf Green! This bugger's mad! He needs settling for good! Tell the police that dog's dangerous and needs putting down!" They picked up their leader, but he kept on doubling up with pain. When he could finally stand unaided, he said, "I'll stay here and watch him. You fetch the rest of the lads." Eager to do his bidding, they fled, and soon vanished over the sandhills. Harry knew he was in a jam. The leader was still there. If Harry made off and tried to hide, the leader would follow him and summon up his returning gang from the top of the nearest sand dune. The leader had to be fixed. He walked towards him. The leader tried to back off, but he was still in pain. Harry caught up with him easily as he tried to scrabble to safety up the side of a sand dune. Harry took careful aim and hit the leader on the ankle with the curving length of wood, with all his force. It was the only way. There was a nasty crack. The leader yelped, fell down and held his ankle. "Bastard! You broke it! I'll kill you for that!" Harry didn't say a thing. He went back to his gear and picked it up. He called to the dog and made off up the next slope. The leader made no attempt to follow. He was still nursing his ankle. He soon dropped from sight. Harry tried every trick he knew to dodge them. The trouble was, they could follow his footprints in the sand of the sandhills, and especially the dog's. There would be a dead giveaway. So at first he just plunged ahead regardless, till he came to a little pebbly stream running out of the sandhills to the sea. It gave him an idea. First he milled around all over the place, but especially where the tall grass grew in clumps, and his footsteps didn't show. When he'd made an utter confusion of the whole area and laid a dozen false trails, he got the dog by the collar and walked him to the sea down the little pebbly stream where no footprints showed. After that, they walked up to their ankles in the waves, heading north. The gentle breaking waves hid everything, but it was dicey walking on the open beach. So when another stream came down to the sand, he walked the dog up it and back into the sandhills. After that, all he could do was stick to the bottom of the dunes, the little valleys that ran between them, and hope for the best. He found other lines of footprints, even the prints of another large dog, and that cheered him. There were other people on the dunes, solitary men with binoculars, family groups on holiday with dogs. He kept well clear of them, out of sight. He didn't want them reporting his presence to the gang. He never saw the gang again. By dusk, with much weary walking up and down through sliding sand, he was back on the beach that led to the sand bridge. The sand bridge wasn't far away. It seemed a little narrower than it had been that morning, with little wavelets eating at its edges, but it was still more than 200 metres across, and he couldn't wait to get off this horrible island. He and the dog slid like shadows onto the end of the bridge and vanished into the gathering dark. Back nearer the village, The wooden warning sign told that the time for safe crossing was half an hour past, but he had been careful to go nowhere near the village. Chapter 15. The trouble was, he was a town child. He believed in roads that stayed as roads, bridges that stayed as bridges. He believed he had a God-given right of way. He didn't know the sea. It was not that he was a fool. He kept a sharp eye on the lines of tiny distant breakers on each side of him that glowed with the white of breaking surf in the dark. In a way, they were a guide, like the white lines they had painted on the edge of pavements back home to guide people when the blackout started. He began to get the worrying idea that the white lines were getting nearer, but it was hard to judge in the dark. He hurried as fast as he could, but he was utterly weary. His luggage weighed a ton. The pans banging against his bottom were nagging enemies now. He stopped and looked behind. The cursed island was fading to a low, dim, mottled hump, but in front the Northumbrian coast seemed no nearer. Low, flat, boring. Get on, get on. Yes. The lines of surf were moving together. The bridge ahead was narrower now, seeming little wider than the big wide coast road at home. He swung round. Should he make back to the island? He didn't want to. He hated the place, and he was a good way out from it now. And then, as he watched in horror, a wave, more determined than the rest, kept on and on until it had rolled right across the sand bridge between him and the island. For an awful moment there was no bridge, just sea. Then the bridge heaved into sight again, like a long whale breaking surface, but narrower still. He looked towards the mainland. The bridge there was still quite wide, unbroken. The way ahead was safer. He must have run another 100 meters. The very quality of the sand under his feet seemed to be changing, growing wetter, soggier, softer. He was slithering rather than running. His feet couldn't get a grip anymore. And then he saw it. The wave in front that swept right across the sand bridge. Frantic, he looked behind again. There was no sign of the sand bridge at all, just the waves rolling across, one after the other. Run! 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 The dog ran with him, barking urgently, but he just knew he wasn't going to make it. The world was changing its rules. He ran into the next wave as it crossed in front. His feet were soaking, icy in an instant. The sand under them was like freezing porridge. He was waddling slowly like a duck, and the mainland looked as far away as ever. It came to him that he was going to drown. There was no way that he couldn't drown. He couldn't run a mile, he couldn't run 50 meters. And the next crossing wave was halfway to his knees, and strong. He felt the tug of it. And now the whole sand bridge was gone for good. Even between waves it wasn't showing. Where had all the water come from so quickly? He couldn't even work out which way to go anymore. He was standing up to his ankles in the whole wide, trackless sea. He felt dizzy as the endless waves moved past him with their burden of sand. The ground seemed to be moving under him, sucking his feet away. He nearly fell, and there was nothing to hang on to in the whole moving world. He gave one last, despairing gaze around. And then he saw it. Leaning crookedly out of the sea, dimly dark against the moving waves. The watchtower! The second watchtower! He remembered oddly the writing scratched inside the walls of the first watchtower. Caught again. A bitter cold night. The tower was a refuge for people trapped by the tide. Before it became really clear in his mind, he was floundering towards it. The waves were up to his knees now, really pushing him away towards the left. There were deeper bits where the water sloshed up, freezing him between his legs, freezing him up so he had no feeling. He had to keep looking for the watchtower because the waves were pushing him off course. And all the time the dog was alongside, barking joyously, thinking it was another game. He fell full length, hauled himself back upright with a choking scream, fell again, and the waves rolled over him. Scrambling, crawling, underwater. Then a lungful of air that ended in water again. But the tower was looming up. A huge wave that drove the dog sideways into him so that he went down in a flailing tangle. Up, breathing, screaming, gargling, drowning. And then something hard and solid banged against his head. He grabbed and he had it. Worked sideways towards the bottom of the ladder, hanging on like a limpet as the waves hit him. Foot of the ladder. Climb, climb. His soaking clothes dragged him back. His gear was like a heavy hand on his shoulders. He pushed open the door and collapsed inside. He waited for the dog to arrive and to land on top of him. No dog. Still no dog. He swung around and looked down. In the darkness he could see the dog's head, and only the dog's head at the bottom of the ladder. It wasn't standing anymore. It was swimming now. As he looked, a wave swept the head away to one side. He screamed, "Don!" Then he saw the dog, in between waves, trying to swim back. Why hadn't it climbed the ladder after him? And then he realised. The ladder was too steep. The rungs were rusted away, too thin. No way could a big dog like Don climb it, especially from swimming in the sea. Don was going to drown. He was a good swimmer, but he was too far from land, and the waves were big, and the dog wouldn't leave him to save itself. It was being killed by its own faithfulness. Something inside him snapped. The dog was the other half of him. The dog was the last person he had left. Without the dog, the world would be empty. You shan't have him. You shan't have him as well, or you might as well have me too. Screaming swear words at he knew not what, he threw off the burden on his back and went pell-mell down the ladder into the sea. It was deep now. It came up to his shoulders. Its cold, entering the coldness of his own body, flooded him, took all his breath away. But when he opened his eyes, he saw the head of the dog swimming up to him again, just a dark blob with two depressed ears against the low glow of the breaking surf. He grabbed its collar, and the ladder doubly hard, as he felt the muscular swell of the next wave coming in to hit them. He thought his arms had been pulled off his body. But when the wave passed, the dog was still close to him, its hair floating queerly in the water, tickling his hand. "Oh, boy!" He heaved the dog at the ladder. It scrabbled at the thin iron rung with its front feet, not able to get a grip. He knew there was only one thing to do, and he did it without thinking. He took a breath, ducked under water, got his shoulder under the dog's broad haunch, and heaved. By the time the next wave hit him, he was standing upright on the sand with both hands on the ladder, and the dog, an incredible weight, was standing on his shoulders, clear of the water. It scrabbled above him, but it couldn't get any higher. As the next wave came, he put one foot on the ladder and tried to step up. The lifting power of the wave did it. His leg muscles screamed with pain, but he made the step up. Waiting for the next big wave, timing it just right, he made another step up, and a third. But with every step up, the lifting power of the waves decreased. He stuck on the third step. He couldn't make the fourth. His hands were going numb with cold. He couldn't feel his legs. He felt the huge wave coming. It must be 2 steps this time or nothing. That was all he was ever going to be able to manage. It was a very huge wave. Spluttering like a maniac, he managed 1, 2, then incredibly 3. It was impossible, but he did it. The next second he felt a tremendous convulsive kick from the dog's hind legs. Then no weight at all. And he knew he'd failed, and could never do it again. Don! Don! He hung on, blinded by seawater, not wanting to do anything ever again. Let go. Let the sea take you. No more trying. No more pain. Then a burst of barking hit his ears as the seawater drained from them. He looked up, and the dog's head was sticking out of the open door. It was quite easy after that. He only had to rest between every step he took. It was not so bad. The 2 blankets in the middle of his bedroll were only damp. He stripped and rubbed himself down with them, then wrapped them round himself. He would have liked to rub the dog down too, but there was nothing else left dry to do it with. There were nails knocked into the wall of the hut, and he wrung out his clothes and hung them out to dry. Some hope. For the sea was still rising, climbing the rungs of the ladder one by one inexorably. He wondered, quite calmly, if the tide ever rose so high, the waves ever grew so wild that the refuge on top was entirely submerged. If so, there was nothing he could do about it. And the sea sent its messengers before it. The very air he breathed was full of salty spray, so that he breathed a mixture of air and water, half boy, half fish. And the bigness of the sea overwhelmed him, the bigness of the sound of it. The land seemed so far away it was nowhere, nothing but sea. The sound of the waves didn't soothe him. The sea had tried to kill him, might still kill him. Meanwhile, he watched it. In the end, with bitter satisfaction, he watched it lose its force, like a beaten army, and start to retreat, rung by rung. Only then did he curl up in the 2 blankets and fall asleep. Sunlight wakened him, falling in through the half-open door onto his face. He tried getting up and could hardly move, he was so cut and bruised and stiff. He peered out at his enemy. The enemy was nowhere to be seen. Nothing but flat sand steaming gently in the sun. Seaweed, feeding gulls, a mottled duck leading her mottled chicks to drink at a stream of fresh water that flowed across the sands. He realised how thirsty he was, but he'd have to get dressed first. Those thin, rusty ladder rungs would cut his bare feet to ribbons, as they must have cut Don's paws last night. The dog was lying looking at him, still half-soaked, its fur in great wet lumps. It was licking its paw, and red blood showed. Jesus, he'd got Don up last night. How on earth was he going to get him down? The sand looked dizzyingly miles away. Shivering, he dragged on his damp clothes. It was only then that he realised the precious attaché case had gone. He didn't even remember dropping it in the fight against drowning. All the insurance policies and all the ration books, the little bottle of brandy, the lost of Mam and Dad and Dulcie, and Dad's watch that he only wore for best. Still, he was thirsty, so he climbed down and had a drink. It was such a calm, warm, lovely morning. But for once, the lovely morning didn't work. He just kept thinking about the attaché case and feeling totally guilty and miserable. Don barked at him hopelessly, absurdly from the door of the watchtower. How was he going to get him down? And yet, that solved itself so easily. A man with a horse and cart coming across the sands. "Hey kid, what's that dog doing up there?" "He's my dog. We got caught by the tide last night. Want me to fetch him down for you?" "Oh, please." He was a huge man, the biggest Harry had ever seen. He just climbed up the ladder, spoke to the dog, heaved him over his shoulder, and climbed down with him. On his shoulder, Don didn't look much bigger than a fox terrier. "You want to get that dog's paw seen to, it's a bad cut." Then he was off across the sands again. A miracle. But it didn't make Harry feel any better. He began to worry about getting Don to a vet. Felt for the banknotes he always carried in the right-hand pocket of his raincoat. A shapeless, sodden wad of green paper that he had to squeeze the water out of. He tried to peel off a note and it began to tear. He didn't even feel like crying. He was beyond crying. He didn't feel he had any tears left in him. He didn't feel he had any blood left in him. But they had to get ashore. The man had told him he only had an hour. Halfway to the shore, he saw something brown and square in the middle of a rock pool. It couldn't possibly be. But it was. The attaché case. It was a morning for miracles. But strangely, that didn't make him feel any better either. The miracles were coming too late, especially as, when he picked up the attaché case, it was far too heavy and deluged water out of the corners. Inside, everything was sodden, ruined. But he wearily picked it up and plodded on. They reached the land. They went as far as the main road, but Don was limping worse and worse, so they went and sat down on the grass by the roadside. He got Don to show him his paw. The dog was very reluctant. The gash was still bleeding and full of sand and muck and little stones. Don wouldn't let him take the stones out. Must hurt too much. So they just went on sitting and sitting, while the tide came in and began to go out again. Harry just felt that his own personal tide had gone out forever. It was never coming back. It was all no good. He had fought and schemed and walked and gathered sea coal all these weeks, and now they were worse off than ever. It was no good trying any more. No matter how hard you fought, everything just went wrong in the end. The chip shop at Tynemouth, the stay with Joseph, Artie, his own little pillbox, Lindisfarne, the further shore. All useless. Look at Ada's mother. All that adventure and cheerfulness and flying and climbing mountains, and now she was just a fat old lady falling downstairs and waiting to die. Everybody died in the end. He wished they'd drowned last night. By now all his troubles would be over. Even the airman's marvellous watch had stopped, the water glass dewed with droplets. With that thought in his mind, he fell asleep. He never noticed the man. The man had been noticing him for some time. He was in a tiny Austin 7. He had passed once and seen Harry sitting there. When he passed again an hour later, Harry was still sitting in the same place. The man took much more interest this time. The third time the man drove past, Harry was lying on the grass verge asleep, and Don was sitting holding up his bloody paw helplessly and watching the passing traffic. The man drove past Harry, then stopped his car with a tiny squeal of brakes. He seemed to sit for a long time, hands on the wheel, as if he was having an inner argument with himself. Then he banged his hands on the steering wheel as if he'd made up his mind to do something. Then he backed the car slowly to where Harry was lying and got out. End of side 6.